Hello and welcome to the Gamecraft Podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Lasky.
I'm Blake Robbins.
And this is a podcast about the modern history of the video game business. Episode 6, The Console Castles.
The relevance of consoles in the modern video game business.
So, Blake, we've spent the last 5 episodes of this series concentrating on the most dynamic business environments in gaming. The PC, particularly online and multiplayer PC, casual, mobile. As of today, mobile and PC now represent 75% of the $180 billion video game business and growing. But if you were a Rip Van Winkle gamer who had fallen asleep in 1985 and woken up today, there would be one massive question on your mind. What happened to consoles? In the 80s, console software revenues essentially were the video game business. Outside the surprisingly large coin-op business and a tiny sliver of PC game revenues, consoles dominated the industry. Yet today, console software revenues represent only 25% of game sales, and that share is declining as PC and mobile game segments keep growing, while console revenues are projected flat or to grow very, very slowly over the next few years.
Yeah, you and I had a little disagreement of whether we were even going to do this episode. You were hesitant. I was probably the more insistent person here. Why were you so hesitant to even do this episode?
Primarily because we had structured this series as a podcast about business models and their impact on the game business and the games that get made and the games that get played. The main reason we haven't talked that much about consoles is that the console business hasn't changed that much in the last 40 years. Sure, it generates considerable revenue, but so does the grocery business. The ebb and flow of popular console genres like platformers, sports and fighting games, to shooters, to adventure games like The Last of Us and Elden Ring, it really has little effect on the console sector as a business. Publishers have gone from selling cartridges to CD-ROMs to digital downloads with almost no change in the business model.
Wasn't console itself a disruptive business to the coin-op business back in the day?
Yeah, I mean, you could make that argument that the console entered the market as a disruptive innovation. I mean, you were coming out of a period where the coin-op arcade business was the dominant business and was really actually a sizable business. I mean, if you go back and look at market share in the video game business during that period, I think it's surprising to see how big a share the arcades had and how long that share persisted after the introduction of the consoles. But yeah, suddenly you could play arcade-like games in your living room. And you could do so without having to feed quarters to this machine for endless hours and also put up with the strange social dynamic of the video game arcades of the 80s.
You and I had talked about this offline, but even this idea of, split screen or shared games like a FIFA or a Pong were just so magical on consoles, and they still are. Like FIFA with your friends in your house is still just an amazing experience.
Yeah, and it sort of started as a mass market business, which was also very interesting because I think by being a mass market business, they had to make it easy to use. So the idea of the plug-and-play console where you plug it into the wall, put in a couple of controllers, figure out an interface to your television set, and boom, you're in business playing video games. That was the initial competitive advantage of the console and kind of remains the competitive advantage of the console to this day.
Yeah, I was a console kid. My parents actually wouldn't let me get a gaming PC. And I feel like it wasn't until probably 8-9 years ago I actually got a gaming PC. And then it seems like everyone started to. I think it's important to probably just take a step back of how did this happen? Why did the PC gaming market start to rise while the console market started to erode?
I think in large part, it was the lack of dynamism in the console model itself. Consoles are fundamentally a razor and blades business. You sell this expensive piece of hardware, this appliance, and then you sell software for as many years as you can squeeze out of it until you've got your installed base to the point where you have to sell them a new bit of kit and update their hardware with the latest generation of console hardware. And I think that kind of a business doesn't really lend itself to a lot of innovation and rapid change. I mean, you're locked into this manufacturing cycle, and those manufacturing cycles have historically been, they were 5 years very predictably during the early days. There was like an 85, 90, 95, 2000, 2005. More recently, they've stretched those cycles out to 7 or 8 years, and we'll talk about why that's important later on. But basically, you spend a fortune on research and development and on a software development kit so that your third parties can build new games on this new appliance. And so you launch really deep in the red. I mean, you are often, in the modern examples, down billions before you even get the console on the market. Then, as you reach the economies of manufacturing scale over the following years, and you continue to see increasing software revenues from first-party and from third-party games as that install base grows, you start to see a return on that huge R&D investment. In fact, the fat part of the market is out in years 4 and 5, or in modern instances, years 6, 7, and 8, when it's truly mass market and you've got hundreds of millions of units out there. And the more mass market type games, typically licensed intellectual property, starts coming into the picture. And so you're starting to now sell to children, and you're starting to sell to adults, and not just the hardcore gamers who are the early adopters of these platforms. And so just when it starts getting good, you have to go back into the labs and come up with a new cycle, reinvest in hardware, and go billions back in the hole while you're coming up with whatever it is that the new turn of the screw is going to be in this business, whether it's the Xbox One or whether it's the PlayStation 5 or whatever. So I think that has a lot to do with the conservatism that we see in the console business and the lack of innovative business models is because there's this macroeconomic circumstance that's really driving a lot of the economic activity in the space.
Yeah, it's amazing when you think about how that contrasts with obviously the PC and mobile business, where it seems like those are upgrading. My GPU at this point is really experienced Moore's Law, where I can't even fathom the level that it can reach. Like, honestly, my monitor probably can't even comprehend the resolution that it can output. And that's in direct contrast to obviously the Xbox One or the PS5, where it's just a completely different resolution, and it's already behind what is currently in market.
So you have all of these economic pressures in both the PC and in the mobile phone business that are allowing for very rapid annual sort of micro upgrades of the platforms. Whereas in the console business, you don't have that. You have these massive initial investments, and then you have to watch them play out over a 5 to 7 year period, which, as we know in the technology business, is a long time.
We've talked about this at length so far in the podcast, and really in episode 1, where the console business is still a packaged goods business for the most part.
And I think that's a really important point, because the hardware manufacturers really live on their own software publishing businesses. And we'll talk about this later. I mean, Microsoft, Sony, Nintendo are the largest publishers on their own platforms. But also they live on third-party software license fees. I mean, when I was still doing this back in 2000, the introduction of the Xbox and the PlayStation 2, Sony and Microsoft were charging $7 a unit in per unit royalties and $3 a unit on manufacturing fees, because they had a monopoly on the disc manufacturing and packaging manufacturing for their own platforms as well. It's really not easy for the third parties to implement a disruptive business strategy like free-to-play, for example, when they're facing a $10 per unit minimum royalty just to the console owner for pressing the disc. Even if they don't end up selling the disc, they're already $10 in the hole just right out of the starting gate.
Yeah, this just really confirms that if you were a console manufacturer, you actually had very little incentive to try and change your business strategy. It seems like you had moats or almost monopolies in a lot of ways in all these different areas. And obviously that's how free-to-play and these other topics that we've discussed in this podcast rise. But if you are a console manufacturer, you're like, we have a great thing going, why mess it up?
Yeah, you've named this episode The Console Castles, and I think you named it that for good reason, at least as far as I can tell. The console hardware and software ecosystems are these massive monarchy-supporting defensive structures that keep out the foreign invaders, in this case, the innovative or disruptive business models. At the same time, the console monarchs are bequeathing these distribution advantages to their vassals, right? These well-funded publishers who can afford the high cost of capital of working on these platforms. And they're keeping the startup people outside of the walls. We don't want the rabble in here messing up our business model. And so in a lot of ways, these really are almost medieval structures, these console ecosystems.
We've talked a little bit offline about this, but it really does feel like there's some strong parallels to the feature film business or Hollywood.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, the consoles have become the video game industry equivalent of the feature film business. I mean, while cable TV, then video on demand, and then the video streaming services exploded, the cinemas and their big Hollywood studio partners who distributed through them, they just stood pat on this butts in seats with a popcorn and a Coke model until it was almost too late. They were addicted to the revenue from opening weekends and exclusive release windows, and they oriented their marketing and their distribution accordingly. And like the consoles, the theatrical film business is kind of still hanging on, but it has become a sport of kings. It's just dominated by a few big-budget event films like Endgame or Top Gun or Avatar. But a dwindling number of creative sources are really supplying content to the cinema model. And in the meantime, the competitors are innovating and kind of passing them by. I mean, most people would consider prestige television to really be the domain of the best storytelling in linear media these days, no longer the cinema, which had reigned supreme for 100 years. That sounds kind of familiar to what's been going on in the games business.
Exactly. It seems like in the feature film business, it is sort of the giants that are continuing to put out these big budget films that, predictably perform, but the real creative genius is accruing to these other platforms. And I think we're seeing the same dynamic occur on PC and mobile when you compare it to the actual console business, where the console business is sort of these 8 or 9 or maybe 7 major players that are actually putting games out there. And it's for a startup, as you said, to try and compete on console, it's unfathomable. We sit in these seats as venture capitalists, and I think if a founder came to us and said they were going to try and start a game and ship it on console, we would be like, what? Why? Like, how do you even do that?
Yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit more in the later parts of this episode. But yeah, the console business is a really tough place to play for all of the reasons that we've discussed.
It is ironic, though. The only part of the modern console business that's thriving is the subscriptions and digital service aspects. If you look at something like an Xbox Live, I think it just recently crossed $5 billion per year in revenue, which is just insane. And it still is meaningful. But that is the only really interesting part of the console business.
Yeah, I mean, I think the stat is it's like 20% of console software revenues are now subscriptions and digital services, which is pretty meaningful when you think about it. And those digital services are growing double digits, 15, 20% year over year, while the actual game revenue, like box product and downloads, are flat to down. So you're right. I mean, I think it is kind of funny that the part of the console business that's actually working are these things that look more like the mobile or the PC business.
It's actually a really crazy concept that Xbox Live even sort of exists, because it is this walled garden thing where when I was a kid, you quite literally pay $60 a year to play the game online. Like, that is your online matchmaking service, sort of, or your friends list. And it's a beautiful sort of mode that can only exist when you have the hardware. But even that subscription product is really tied to the hardware itself.
Yeah, I mean, nice work if you could get it, right? Like, you have 100 million user business in Xbox Live that's generating $5 billion a year in revenue, and basically, like, your users have no choice.
Exactly. Yeah, like if you want to play online, that is the only way that you can play online, which is pretty crazy to think about.
So let's go back and talk a little bit about the history of these console empires that we've specced out in this initial section, and talk about sort of how they've ebbed and flowed over the years. And it may inform some of the way we look at what's going on today as being maybe a little bit more contingent, having seen what's been happening in the past. Look, the consoles are a product of the late 1970s. We already talked about how the initial console business really came in response to the arcade coin-op business earlier in the 1970s, and how they domesticated in a lot of ways the video game and brought it into the living room. And so you had the Magnavox Odyssey, and then really the Atari 2600, which was, in my opinion, sort of the first modern console. The 2600 came from this super interesting company, Atari, that if we were doing bonus episodes, I think the Atari story merits its own episode. I mean, they were involved in everything. And when we're going to talk in the next episode about virtual reality, Atari was playing in virtual reality in the early 80s. So, I mean, this is a really innovative and interesting company over the years. They also, oddly, gave birth to the third-party publisher, and it's something we're going to talk about later in this episode, but one of their great game designers, David Crane, who made many of their early hits on first-party games on the platform, left in 1979 and founded a company that we now know of as Activision.
Wow. I remember reading through this and sort of researching for this episode. And obviously we know Activision and Activision Blizzard today as this giant and publishes all these games, but I had no idea that it actually came all the way back to the roots of Atari. And specifically, it gave birth to that third-party publisher, which is just sort of mind-blowing to me that at that time it was, and it makes sense that it was primarily first-party and almost all first-party games. But now you have Activision come on the scene and create this third-party publisher. But when we started to research, or when I started to research, I didn't realize what this actually unlocked. And I think it's worth touching on. Like, it created a whole new wave of third-party publishers. Like, it didn't just immediately, like, this is one third-party publisher and it's staying. Everyone started to become a third-party publisher.
And that actually became a problem because you had so much proliferation of content, both first-party and third-party in those early days after the formation of Activision, those 4 years between 79 and 83, that you actually ended up with the first real crisis in the console business, which was the great software glut of 1983. I mean, legendarily, they were burying 1 million cartridges of E.T. in some Arizona desert. I don't even know if I'm sure those stories are apocryphal, but nevertheless, it was really the first challenge to the console business model, which was this overinvestment in really low quality products swamping the market.
Obviously, that happens in 1983. How does the market actually respond to that?
Well, 2 Japanese companies really kind of pulled the market back from the brink. So those companies are well known to us today, Sega and Nintendo. They both launched new hardware in 85, 2 years later. Sega had really deep roots in the coin-op arcade business, while Nintendo, a company we're going to spend a lot of time talking about in this episode, was like a 100-year-old playing card company. The Nintendo Entertainment System, or the NES, had a really interesting and innovative third-party licensing regime, and these incredible house brands like Mario, Zelda, Metroid. It just dominated that hardware cycle, and it sold like 60 million units.
We finally have the rise of Sega and Nintendo. Sega today, we know, isn't really a console manufacturer. How does that play out after the two of them launch? Is it the Genesis at the time for Sega, or do you know what they released at that time?
Genesis comes the next hardware cycle. So that was 1985. Then in 1990, and remember, we're on these 5-year cycles at this point. 1990 arrives with the Super NES, the SNES, and the Sega Genesis. Sega beats Nintendo. They sort of jumped the gun and beat Nintendo to market by roughly a year with their Genesis. And so they were able to grab a little bit of additional market share during that period and put up a challenge. I think a lot of gamers have very fond kind of nostalgic feelings about this era of the cartridge gaming market. The Sega Genesis was a great bit of hardware, very high performance, and there were all these amazing games for the Super Nintendo as well. So this may have been sort of the golden age of living room cartridge gaming. So then you get to 1995, and Sony releases the PlayStation. And this is the first real outside challenge to the duopoly of Sega and Nintendo. And the PlayStation, they took this Sony News workstation. This was the era of like the graphics workstation where you had silicon graphics. I mean, remember in this era, one of my initial introductory eras to the video game business, game companies were being valued on the number of silicon graphics workstations that they had. Like if you had 20 silicon graphics workstations, that was like a $10 million Series A valuation, right? It was that crazy that they were that important to your productivity in those days. And so Sony had built this thing, the News workstation, and they value engineered the technology from this News workstation, this highly real-time graphical environment, into basically a really powerful living room console, the PlayStation. And they launch in 95 with a CD-ROM as the game format, as opposed to these hardware cartridges. And we're going to talk about this transition at some point later in this episode, but it was very innovative. Nintendo sticks with their popular circuit boards, cartridges from the past generations with the N64, and Sega's back in the market, but Sony makes a real entry with that 1995 launch of the PlayStation.
At some point, Microsoft, we know, enters the scene. How does that happen?
So 5 years pass, and we've now seen Lara Croft and some of these great PlayStation games that are iconic since that era. There was an engineer, kind of Falstaffian figure at Microsoft in that era called Alex St. John, and he had worked on the Windows 95 technology that came out and really, in a lot of ways, sparked the beginning of the boom of PC gaming, because Windows 95 included a lot of really game-friendly technologies in this under-the-hood SDK that they had built called DirectX. Alex and his team decided that they could use this DirectX and they could use off-the-shelf PC technologies, which were now so powerful as Moore's Law continued to push the PC chip world forward, that they could take some of these off-the-shelf technologies, put them together into a console with DirectX, and compete with Sony and with Nintendo in this space. And so they did so, and they built the Xbox. This was the sort of end of my era in the mainstream video game business. I'm actually in the launch video at GDC for the Xbox. In my role as head of studios at Activision, I'm heaping praise on Bill Gates and his team for bringing this wonderful device to market.
Yeah, I think that's my favorite Easter egg in gaming history is you watch that GDC talk of Bill Gates sort of announcing or talking about why the Xbox is so important. And you just see Mitch just randomly in the video saying like, we're so excited to bring, I think you say like Tony Hawk or something to the Xbox.
I know, I look like I'm like 12. Over the next couple of cycles, Sony and Microsoft took over the mainstream high-end console business. These things got incredibly powerful. I mean, Sony was building basically supercomputer level processing for the day into the PlayStation. And so much the case that the US and the Japanese government restricted distribution of some of the later PlayStations to unfriendly nations, like nations on the Korean Peninsula or China, because they were national security risks having this technology exported. It was that powerful. These things had broadband connectivity, absolutely insane graphics, and they became the platforms of choice for core gamers. Sega kind of fell off during this era and ultimately went back to the arcade and concentrated on really high-end location-based systems, virtual reality, other things like that they invested in heavily during this period. But it was Nintendo faced with this massive competitive threat that took the most innovative approach.
Yeah, you talk about the one empire falling, or one of the castles falling here with Sega saying, hey, you know what, this is a different game. Nintendo seemingly isn't competing on the CD-ROM side. It isn't competing on the actual graphics or anything like that. So how does Nintendo survive what seems like a duopoly of high-end gaming? Where does Nintendo sort of play in all of this?
I mean, really, in a word, software. Nintendo doubled down on their amazing house brands, first for the N64, and then later for this new GameCube, which they built on a sort of their attempt to honor the optical media. They built their own, of course, proprietary mini DVD media. But the real break comes in 2006 when they released the Wii, which both had incredibly innovative gameplay because you had these controllers and there was a physical component to the gameplay in the real world with motion sensing and all these other things. They've always, since the Microsoft and Sony duopoly emerged as the core gaming duopoly in the console business, they've always sailed off in their own direction. They've done very innovative things on the hardware side, and of course, they had the games that people would want to come back to again and again, and they were able to deploy them on each new console with more and more success.
It's honestly amazing because Nintendo is sort of playing this completely different game. Microsoft and Sony are just going head to head, really trying to almost go feature parity. Well, you have Nintendo on the side just playing their own game, and they're creating some amazing first-party content. But when you look at the top-selling consoles of all time, Nintendo still has 5 of the top 10, and they were really the dominant player despite having this other sort of war that was happening.
Yeah, it's funny because it really speaks to the fact that those PC KPIs, if you will, of like megaflops and power and speed and graphic throughput and all these other things were only really part of the game. They weren't the primary driving factors of why people were buying these home consoles. I mean, Nintendo does it again in 2017 with the Switch, which is this hybrid device that can be played as a kind of tablet-like portable on the one hand and then plugged into your television set on the other. And again, it's like 720p. It's not even state-of-the-art in terms of its graphical throughput for the day. They could have done it, but they didn't need to. It was just good enough to do the stuff that they needed it to do, and boom, another cycle, another 100 million plus units of sell-through.
I think it's particularly interesting to highlight where the actual threat to Nintendo comes. It's not actually from Microsoft or Sony that is giving them like a real challenge at this point, because those two are playing their own game. It's actually the mobile phone that is starting to like give Nintendo a real scare of, okay, wait, now we're competing with all these other games.
Well, to understand that, I think we got to go back a little bit and talk about Nintendo in the handheld business, because the place where Nintendo had the strongest monopoly that persisted through this entire era, essentially, was in handheld. In 1989, they released the Game Boy, which became a beloved device, and it was a dedicated portable game machine. It didn't do anything else. We talked earlier, we were joking about the fact that like they had released a camera for it and a printer. I mean, there was some stuff that was classic Nintendo weirdness that came along with the Game Boy, but primarily this was a cartridge-based handheld game device. And it came on the market in 89, sold like 125 million units. In 2004, they released the DS. That reaches an even higher level of installed base. I mean, I think it gets to like 150 million unit installed base. Sony comes to market with the PlayStation Portable, which does very well and gets to like 80 million units, which by comparison, it's probably a fraction of the market, but in any other market, it would be an absolute home run. But Nintendo had such an incredible lock on this market. Obviously, over time, as portable technologies and the underlying infrastructure to build them continued to get better and better, many other attempts to compete with them in the handheld and in the larger sort of portable market happened. I mean, you had big companies like Atari and Sega and others. You had the Atari Lynx, you had the Sega Game Gear, you had the Sega Nomad. Nokia built a game-specific portable called the N-Gage. Neo Geo built the Pocket. You had the Tapwave Zodiac, which was built on the Palm handspring underlying operating system. You had the NVIDIA Shield. This quixotic hope seems to spring eternal in the sector that if you just get the hardware right, just build it and they will come, like the baseball movie says. And it never works. Valve has recently entered the market with the Steam Deck, which I have to say probably is the most viable device of its sort that we've seen come to market, basically because it has a software library like Nintendo and Sony had, which they can leverage in this business. But even in the last couple of years, we've seen Wonder and a new company like Playtron come to market raising funding. It's inexplicable to me how these companies continue to get funded. I think I've identified 15 examples, including a couple of Chinese-specific examples, that have gotten funded over the last 20 years. And with the exception of the Sony PlayStation, none of them have succeeded. I think the jury's still out on the Steam Deck. Like, they're a couple million units in. I think Valve's committed to it. We'll see how it goes. But until it gets to, roughly 100 million unit scale, it's not really going to make a dent in the Nintendo and Sony empires.
Yeah, there's a reason why this episode is called Console Castles, and these are real empires, and you're going up against real giants. And like you said, these consoles, like a Microsoft or Sony, are investing billions of dollars to get these actually developed, and they're losing a lot of money for the first couple of years, and that's just not a game that startups are equipped to play.
Totally. To your point that you made earlier, I think we can come back to it now, understanding why the mobile phone was such a threat to Nintendo. I mean, Nintendo had a big handheld console business. So here was this new device on the market, the mobile phone, that people were buying not because it was a dedicated gaming machine, but for other uses. And then they were using it to play games. So in a lot of ways, the distribution of this device occurred outside of the gaming context. So it was orthogonal to the competitive vectors that Nintendo had built sort of this infrastructure of defensibility around. I mean, this was a company with some of the most beloved intellectual property in gaming. They employed one of the greatest game designers, in my opinion, who has ever lived, Shigeru Miyamoto. On the other hand, they had lost the prestige console market to Sony and Microsoft at the high end, and they knew they couldn't compete directly with iPhones and Android devices with dedicated gaming hardware, given just the incredible utility of mobile phones in people's lives. The mobile phone could be viewed by Nintendo as a potential market for their IP, which was a really remarkable circumstance that they found themselves in. Here was a billion-unit global scale business, an order of magnitude larger audience potentially than they were ever able to see for their own proprietary hardware. And for the first time in their history, they started to suffer operating losses. 2012, they lost money, and they continued to lose money for several years. And for the first time, they started to come under real pressure from investors who were asking them directly, why won't you participate in this insanely valuable market with your incredible IP? So this crisis reaches a boiling point in 2013 with a very amusing incident, where at the Nintendo annual shareholders meeting, and again, Japanese shareholders meetings are very much unlike shareholder meetings in America. I mean, we take for granted that shareholder meetings are kind of uneventful, and usually you do them in a hotel ballroom and 6 people show up and the executives sit on stage not knowing really what to do. No, Japanese shareholder meetings are not like this. They're much more eventful. In 2013, a shareholder at the Nintendo annual meeting stands up and starts expressing concern about Nintendo's plummeting stock price and asks Nintendo CEO Iwata-san what his plans were for mobile phones, to which Iwata answers that they have no plans for mobile phones and suggests that the shareholders buy a DS. The shareholder persists, and he continues this heated exchange with Iwata over his daughter only plays games on her mobile phone, and why doesn't Nintendo play in this market? And ultimately, Iwata gets so mad, he exits the stage, walks down into the ballroom, and punches the shareholder in the face.
Oh my gosh.
And both men are then escorted out of the room by security. So this was where we were in 2013 with Nintendo and the mobile phone.
Clearly, it comes to that boiling point right there in 2013.
Iwata chooses violence.
Exactly. It really does speak to how protective they were of their IP. And actually, this is why when we finally have Niantic launch Pokemon Go, it'd just be such a historic moment on the mobile phone. It's the first time that we're really seeing Nintendo IP on the phone.
Yeah, it's funny because in the gaming business broadly, I think the fact that it was the first time we saw Nintendo IP on the phone is underrated in the analysis of the success of the Niantic Pokemon Go product. It's funny. There were a lot of things that people talk about, summertime, and people went outside, and it was this innovative location-based gameplay, and Niantic had all of this experience from having built Ingress, which was not a commercial success, but which allowed them to really understand how to do map-based, location-based entertainment, et cetera, et cetera. Nobody's like, hey, wait a minute, it's the first time we had Nintendo IP on a mobile phone, and there was an enormous pent-up demand for Nintendo IP on the mobile phone. And I think that was a huge, huge reason for its success.
And obviously, it was a massive success. I remember when it comes out and you literally saw people, even in Michigan, walking around on the streets, looking and trying to catch Pokemon. It was a real cultural moment. But I do think so much of that can be chalked up to it's the first real time there is all this pent-up demand for Nintendo IP on the phone.
Well, look what happens next. They get other big licenses like Harry Potter. They still have a couple in the bag that they haven't brought to market yet, like Marvel. But they put out a Harry Potter game, innovating even beyond what they were capable of with Pokemon, and it kind of falls flat. So Nintendo really turns out to be the outlier here. As Iwata said during an interview during Nintendo's darkest days, to paraphrase, he said something like, "We are a 100-year-old playing card company. We haven't stayed in business this long by changing our ways." And Nintendo's management continuity truly is remarkable in the video game business and unique. Iwata's predecessor, Hiroshi Yamauchi, assumed the CEO seat of Nintendo at age 22 in the post-war Japan of 1949 and served as CEO for 53 years until 2002. I mean, well into the Sony PlayStation and Xbox era. Miyamoto, their incredible lead designer, he has his fingerprints on almost every game that you've heard of that has come out of the Nintendo factory. He joined in 1977 and is still employed there 45 years later. And in a lot of ways, their parochialism ended up working out. The Switch was a huge success. Their killer IP, from Breath of the Wild to Mario Kart to Animal Crossing, continued to succeed on each new platform. They've continued to defend this unique territory in the console wars. And with the staunchest proponent of their go-it-alone strategy now, Iwata, dead from cancer at age 55, and with Miyamoto, who again has his fingerprints on every one of their big hits for the last couple of decades. He's now in his 70s. It's unclear how long they can stay that course, but it is remarkable and one of the more interesting innovation stories in the console business.
For me, when you research the history of Nintendo's actual story as a playing card business to now becoming the giant that it is today, it's this remarkable story of, to their credit, they were somewhat stubborn. They understood what game they were playing, no pun intended. And it's just amazing to watch. And I think we're quickly approaching what the next era will look like. And they have a good foundation to build upon, but who knows what will happen next. I think one piece that we've really talked about in depth at this point is around their first-party strategy, or Nintendo's first-party strategy, and the IP that they've really built out. But I also think it's interesting to highlight their third-party strategy. We teased it a little bit earlier on in this episode, where when the crash happens after David Crane starts and innovates and creates the first third-party publisher with Activision, and we have that legendary crash in 1982, Nintendo is formed out of that, and that's when the NES is launching in 1985. How did they respond to the flood of all these third-party games.
It's understandable in retrospect. They never anticipated a third-party business because one didn't exist at the time. And so because they didn't anticipate a third-party business, they just figured they were always going to be the supplier of product to their own console and that they would be able to control the kinds of games that got made, the quality of those games, etc. Also, because they didn't anticipate a third-party business, they essentially left the barn door wide open. They didn't do anything to restrict third parties from reverse engineering their console socket, if you will, and to manufacture their own consoles that were compatible with the 2600. And so they were kind of the architects of their own demise in an interesting way. Nintendo comes into the market in 85 and they're like, okay, we're not going to let that happen. So they took a couple of really interesting early approaches. I mean, on the one hand, they put this fairly draconian rule in place that the third parties could only release 2 games on the NES per year. Which, you think about what the libraries of third-party console players look like now, and my goodness, that would just be an incredible restriction to have to work under. And they also built a variety of hardware restrictors into the console itself to prevent third parties from trying to gain a foothold without Nintendo's blessing. They prohibited, for example, content that they considered inappropriate, which included what they deemed excessive violence, which I'm sure wouldn't even make many of the games we know of and love today possible on the early NES. This monopolization of the manufacture of authorized cartridges, which was part of this strategy, became, a really important component of this. Again, it's important to go back and think about this because if you haven't lived through this era, you forget what these things were like. These cartridges were literally circuit boards. They had the games burned into read-only memory, these ROMs that you had to essentially sort of pre-spec. You bought the cartridges if you were the third party with a certain amount of ROM memory that you could load your game into. I mean, you remember back in episode 1, we talked about id Software's Carmack's discovery of the ability to do a side-scrolling console-like game on the PC. The reason that was so remarkable at the time, the reason that was so important was because he was doing in software what these consoles did in hardware, because the games were literally in hardware. These cartridges weren't cheap either. I mean, the cost of goods plus license fee for a Nintendo cartridge in the Super NES days was like $15 to $17 a unit, depending upon how much ROM the game required. That's more than a third of the sell-in price, which was typically like $45 for a $60 game, the difference obviously being the retailer's margin. I remember conversations from my early days at Activision where studio management insisted on reducing the scope of certain games because otherwise they would require another ROM to go up to the next tier of ROM inside of the cartridge, and as a result would cost millions of dollars to produce the inventory necessary to, let's say, sell in for Christmas.
Nintendo obviously does that, and they become really restrictive around even just the cost and your margin. But from what I remember and what I read, they also, I think, do a lockout chip. Is that right?
They didn't at first, interestingly enough. You'll learn at the end of this why I know so much about this lockout chip. They released originally the Famicom, which was the original name of the NES in Japan. They release it without the lockout chip. And of course, almost immediately, bootleg cartridges start appearing on the market. And, Nintendo didn't want this. They had tried to route around it, but they hadn't really implemented it at the level of hardware. So with the US and European releases of the NES, they build in this lockout chip. And the lockout chip functions in this way that it's basically an encrypted handshake between the cartridge and the console. If that handshake occurs successfully, then the cartridge is authorized to play on that console. And if not, it's locked out. It's going to sound kind of funny, but the reason I know so much about this lockout chip is because my introduction to the video game business was literally this lockout chip. In 1990, I was just out of law school, had done a lot of stuff on this new field of software copyright and software patent law. And I went to work for a law firm in Los Angeles and was almost immediately assigned to work on Atari Games versus Nintendo, representing Atari Games. So Atari Games, not the same Atari we talked about, the manufacturers of the 2600. After that console maker's hard times in 83, they got sold to Warner's and a bunch of corporate machinations occurred, and the name was used in some subsidiaries and other kinds of joint venture businesses over the years. And this was basically an Atari Namco joint venture that owned the rights to some of the older Atari arcade games. They'd reconstituted it basically as a third-party publisher making software for the Nintendo console. So in '88, they succeeded in reverse engineering the Nintendo lockout chip, Handshake. They started building their own authorized bootlegs of the Nintendo cartridges. And the reason that they could do this was there was pre-existing law that said that if you had clean roomed this problem, basically, that you had avoided the copyright pitfalls of access and substantial similarity, you could design something compatible legally. And so they had done that. And I was working on a bunch of the different patent infringement claims and other things. I ended up taking the deposition of Nintendo of America president and future Seattle Mariners chairman Howard Lincoln during that era, and also went around and met all of these people from the early days of Atari who had worked on the arcade consoles even before the introduction of the Atari 2600. And it was like, wow, these people are incredibly cool. I would prefer to hang out with these people than the lawyers that I'm having to hang out with day by day. And so I think that case in a lot of ways prompted me to quit the law and go into the video game business.
That's got to be one of the crazier entries into the video game business. But I guess that case, we can thank it for giving birth to you and your entire journey in the video game business.
Yeah, and by the way,
crazy.
Atari Games lost for a variety of nefarious reasons unrelated to my representing them. Nintendo ended up maintaining their stranglehold on the console. Interestingly enough, the judge kind of determined that Atari had acted badly during this period and as a result ruled for Nintendo, but they left the door open for others to come and build compatible cartridges if they did it properly with a proper clean room procedure. It's just that the cost of the litigation that you knew you were biting off by entering the market that way was so great. It was worse than paying the license fee to Nintendo just to make authorized cartridges. And so nobody ever really tried to do it again.
It's interesting because Nintendo stuck with the cartridges even through a period of time. And even the GameCube, they do the mini disc instead of the CD-ROM. While we talked about earlier, with the PlayStation introducing the CD-ROM was a big innovation at the time, but you had Nintendo still sort of fighting against and playing their own game of let's continue to do our cartridges because we know that business so well.
Look, PlayStation and Xbox were not altruistic here. Despite the fact that you could manufacture a CD-ROM for probably 75 cents in that era, you still had to pay $3 COGS to get your package made by them. And also you had to pay $7 per unit license fee. So, okay, yeah, it wasn't the $15 to $17 of the Nintendo cartridge era, but it wasn't exactly a bargain. I mean, you were still making an enormous upfront investment. And really think about that. If you plan on selling, let's say, 1 million units of your console game in the Christmas season, you have to pay $10 million up front before you get any revenue just to build the inventory. You typically had to produce a letter of credit in advance just to ensure that you were solvent enough to ultimately pay those COGS once you received the bill. And you couldn't build additional inventory on demand in response to, let's say, your sell-through, because the console owner's monopoly on authorized production meant that you had to get in line with all of your competitors to build additional inventory during, let's say, the Christmas season. So rather than take chances on missing out on fulfilling demand during your peak selling season, you would often overbuild inventory, which means guaranteed license fees for the console castle. This was a rigged game in a lot of ways. And the introduction of the CD-ROM, while it made it more palatable, it certainly didn't solve the problem.
It's more so that the game developers at the time, it ended up becoming the sport of kings, as you said earlier, which is only a select number of players could actually try and compete in this market.
Yeah, obviously, you had to be big and well-capitalized to play. Frankly, big, well-capitalized companies are inherently risk-averse to begin with. So the front-loaded nature of the costs in the console business meant that they were pushed even further to mitigate risks, whether that was through sequels to existing products, brand licenses like Marvel or the sports leagues, or well-worn play patterns that they had already established on previous console games. So not a market that was open to a lot of experimentation, at least not by the third parties. The games that you play are directly influenced by this business model. I mean, there's a reason why people are like complaining about sequels, like, oh, it's just another sequel. Well, there's a reason. And the reason is that the console manufacturers have made it virtually impossible to take real risk.
Yeah, and I think you're touching on probably the most important point of this entire episode, which is the only games that could be manufactured, even probably to this day, for consoles, are these broad mass appeal games that are slightly less risky. And that's why you don't have a ton of long tail games or indie games launch on console.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, we're down today to 7 majors. There's a few more at the periphery, but really there's 7 big companies. I like to think of them in your metaphor as the feudal lords operating at the king's pleasure inside of these console castles. In rough order by revenue, we're talking about Activision, EA, Take-Two, Bandai, Square Enix, Ubisoft, and Konami. These are all really big businesses. I mean, the smallest one of these, Konami, is doing more than $1 billion in console revenue annually. So, I mean, this gives you a sense of the scale of these businesses. This is not an area that is open to startups. So Sony, Nintendo, and Microsoft remain the largest publishers on their own platforms, as we said before. They all have different software strategies, and I think an interesting analogy is to compare them to like the current video streaming companies. Sony's adopted the HBO strategy, prestige in-house adult blockbusters like Last of Us, Uncharted, and God of War, alongside, let's say, the feature film releases from third parties. Nintendo, in this analogy, is more like Disney Plus, mainly using their own must-have house brands, and particularly a really robust children's business. Xbox, on the other hand, which has always been more open to third parties and more open to player community through Xbox Live, would be the Netflix. And as we discussed in the publishing episode, that comparison to Netflix is no longer really only cosmetic. With the launch of Game Pass on console, Microsoft has made perhaps the first really innovative console move in business model since the first consoles 40 years ago.
We've talked about it in the prior episode where Game Pass is offering this access to an entire library through a subscription. So that's why I think the Netflix analogy actually is pretty apt.
Yeah, this wasn't an entirely new idea either. I mean, Electronic Arts had launched EA Play back in 2014, and Sony had launched PlayStation Now that same year. Those services were subscription services, but they were mostly like catalog titles and time-limited demo versions of new games. Although, to be fair, EA Play has evolved over time to include many first-run products, including recent sports titles. Sony also interestingly used streaming with the PlayStation Now service, where the game is run on the server side and only the video and control information is passed down to the client, whether a console, a PC, or a smart TV. You'll hear this often referred to as cloud gaming. It's not something we're going to talk a lot about. Although, interestingly, I have some experience in this because the way that Sony did this with their PlayStation Now offering was by acquiring one of my Series A investments, a company in Orange County called Gaikai, which was a pioneer in this cloud gaming technology, and they used it to power their streaming platform. In 2019, Apple releases Apple Arcade for iOS, so they tried to make a move into the subscription business. It hasn't been super successful. Because they required platform exclusivity on iOS, it made this marginally attractive to real game developers, and it really ended up being kind of the realm of a lot of very highly curated independent developer projects, and also as a way to repurpose some kind of classic titles from the past. So Microsoft launches Game Pass for the Xbox in 2017 and extends it to Windows in 2019. One of the things that's unique about it compared to the previous attempt here is that they try to go to market with a business model that works for third-party publishers. So EA Play is now offered as part of Game Pass, as are titles from other big console manufacturers like Bandai, Capcom, Warner Brothers. They recently announced a deal with Riot Games where they will make free-to-play games like League of Legends available to Game Pass subscribers. You know, a major motivation of their $69 billion bid for Activision was expanding the Game Pass catalog. Even without Activision, Game Pass has become a pretty big business, well in excess of 30 million subs, generating maybe $2 billion a year in annual revenue. So I think that they figured out a way to make it third-party friendly. And I think by making it third-party friendly, they've really made it much more attractive to consumers as well.
It seems like, in hindsight, we can now analyze this, where Microsoft almost, and Phil Spencer, to his credit, sort of waves the flag and says, hey, the console business is interesting, the hardware business is interesting, but really where we think the value is going to accrue is where these games are played, and we want to become that almost platform-based publisher rather than be in the hardware business.
Yeah, and that leads us to really one of the more interesting twists in this story, which is that in 2016, Microsoft, anticipating the launch of Game Pass, they opened this can of worms that remains to this day probably the most important challenge to this console castle paradigm that we've seen, and that is cross-platform play.
Yeah, so what happens in 2016?
So they enable play between the Xbox and the Windows PC using Xbox Live. Kind of in a provocative, tongue-in-cheek way, they invite quote-unquote other networks, meaning Sony, to participate as well. Later that year, Rocket League gets launched as the first title open to Xbox PC cross-platform play. And there's at the time, nothing really preventing Sony from participating in this market. In fact, they interviewed the CEO of Rocket League's developer, and he indicates that they could have enabled PlayStation cross-platform play in literally a matter of hours.
I think that's one of my favorite takeaways from this is Microsoft, to their credit, uses almost Psyonix or Rocket League almost as a pawn to be like, hey, we have a great game. People love it. We're doing crossplay on PC and Xbox. We're ready. PlayStation, just tell us when, and we're going to launch cross-platform. And it really sort of forces the hand and makes a bunch of PR and press at the time. But Sony sort of just sits there and they're like, we can't do that because obviously it really does jeopardize their business.
It was a cool competitive move by Microsoft because you have to remember at the time, they were losing the console wars. PlayStation probably had 2/3 market share of the high-end console market at the time. And so, of course, they don't want to help enable their competitor by allowing it to not matter what console you own in terms of whether or not you get to play multiplayer. I mean, again, remember where we came from. Consoles had enabled multiplayer play since the earliest days of Pong in the 1970s. I mean, 2 controllers for side-by-side play on a single TV screen, whether that's a shared screen like sports games or it's like a split screen, like you've ever played the N64 James Bond classic GoldenEye. As online play grew in importance, the modern consoles accommodated it in some way. Microsoft through Xbox Live, Sony through the PlayStation Network, Nintendo, contrarian as always, decides that they are going to play in this space in a very limited fashion, although that will change later on. Online play immediately raises all these difficult questions like, should consoles permit players of the same game on different platforms to play together? Should Call of Duty players on the Xbox and Call of Duty players on PlayStation be able to compete in a single instance of the game? Certainly, that's a great benefit to Activision, the publisher of Call of Duty, and to the players whose friends may be on other systems. But the console manufacturer's answer to this question was historically always no. They fought to keep their walls intact by forbidding cross-platform play. And through these prohibitions and through the continued prevalence of exclusives limiting titles to single console platforms, the manufacturers forced friend groups to all buy the same console if they wanted to play together.
I lived and breathed this. I was a kid when Xbox 360 came out, and I remember basically going to my friends and be like, what console are you going to buy? Because I want to play FIFA or I want to play Call of Duty with you. What should I buy? And really, we all just sort of colluded together. I guess we're all buying an Xbox 360. It makes sense. Why, if you're a console manufacturer, you would want to keep it so that is a dynamic. But when does that actually come to a head?
Interestingly, it turns out that it's the forever games that force the door open. So as we discussed in the last episode, the biggest and most lucrative titles in gaming today are these online multiplayer games. And it was the success of one of these forever games, Fortnite, that finally breaks this cross-platform wall down. When Epic launches their Battle Royale game in 2017, they, quote, accidentally enable cross-platform play. And when news of this begins to disseminate on forums and in the press, Epic does this mea culpa and they fix it and they say, oh, it was a bug, whatever. But the genie's out of the bottle at this point because fans realize that cross-platform play is totally a possibility. So Epic launches on more platforms, macOS, iOS, Android in early 2018, and the Sony-Microsoft war starts looking even more absurd. The PlayStation 4 players could play with PC, Mac, and mobile Fortnite players, and the Xbox players could also play with PC, Mac, and mobile Fortnite players, but the Microsoft and Sony players couldn't play with each other. Sony is put into a little bit of a box here by the success of Fortnite and by the player demand for the right to play Xbox to PlayStation.
And Microsoft, again, Phil Spencer is sort of out vocally saying, please, Sony, what's going on? Please let us play together. And there's actually a really funny tweet that happens when Fortnite accidentally allows it, where someone's tweeting to Phil Spencer saying hey, why did you guys block that? And Phil Spencer's like, I wish they kept it up. It would have been great. We would have been really happy if they kept that up.
So in mid-2018, they released Fortnite for the Nintendo Switch, and it comes to market fully cross-platform. I think they announced it at E3 that year. So to get maximum PR and to put maximum pressure on Sony. So Sony then is put into the position where they have to ban players who have PS4-linked Fortnite accounts from playing on the Switch. Sets off another wave of negative PR. And with Nintendo now in the cross-platform camp with Microsoft, Sony finally is forced to relent. By the beginning of 2019, Fortnite prevails. This opens cross-platform broadly across the industry, and now pretty much every major game enables cross-platform play. Rocket League, Genshin Impact, Call of Duty, Warzone, Apex Legends, all come to market cross-platform.
There's this interesting moment that happens there where Nintendo sort of is the Trojan horse, which you just wouldn't have expected to be on the side of Microsoft, actually does an ad campaign with Microsoft saying, hey, isn't it amazing that we can play together on Fortnite? Why are you not enabling cross-platform, Sony? And then Sony's like, oh no, we got to let this go out there. But I guess maybe we should just rehash why this is so important.
I mean, it's interesting because you'd think, okay, cross-platform play, who cares on a certain level? How does this impact the business? Well, the answer is it impacts the business in an enormous way. Cross-platform play ends up being vital to the business models of these forever games. In statistics that were released in mid-2020, actually as part of the Apple and Epic litigation, Fortnite discloses that 60% of Fortnite players had played the cross-platform game and 18% had played the game on multiple devices, and that those players, we'll call them the cross-platform players, those players played an astonishing 570% more on average than non-cross-platform players, and for an average of 90 minutes a day more than non-cross-platform players. So cross-platform Fortnite players are literally the new whales. I mean, they disclosed they were monetizing 365% more than their non-cross-platform peers. And again, other publishers reporting similar benefits. So why? Because cross-platform play was money.
When you look at it in hindsight, it all makes sense that playing with your friends would make you more engaged. And that is a critical part of a forever game. And so being able to play with your friends that you were never able to play with, playing Fortnite really does open it up like, oh, this is the only game I can really play with my friends at this time. And Fortnite, to their credit, was very far ahead of everyone else.
And I want to bring this back to one of the key themes in this podcast series. What I think this incident reveals more than anything is the disruptive effect of this key theme, this platform-based publishing challenge to the incumbent business models. In episode 2, we discussed the conflict between the packaged goods publishers of old and the platform-based publishers, and how the platform-based publishers use the internet to disrupt the monopoly of packaged goods in the video game business. Here we're seeing a second major point of disruption, conflicts between, on the one hand, hardware and software platforms and the platform-based publishers on the other. Let's look at some examples. You had Apple's desire to run their iPhone business like a console platform, which meant that they had to keep things like Game Pass and Fortnite and other subscription services out of the iOS App Store because they were stores within the store. And that might endanger Apple's really profitable 30% cut of revenue. So you might sign up for a Fortnite account on your PC and buy things on the PC platform that you then use in Fortnite on your phone. And Apple wouldn't see a dime of that. Apple and Epic have engaged in a bitter court battle over just this issue. Sony has taken the unprecedented step of requiring platform-based publishers to agree to a top-up provision in their licensing agreements as a precondition to their game approvals. The top-up requires the publisher to pay Sony something like a carriage fee, frankly, if the ratio of PlayStation hours played to revenue generated on the Sony network dips below a certain threshold. The carriage fee is basically a proxy for the revenue that Sony feels they should be entitled to for their contribution to the engagement that is being generated for Fortnite. That requirement came out, again, as we said, in all of this disclosure around the Apple and Epic litigation. And there was speculation I read in the press at the time that it was perhaps limited to Fortnite or that it was some special case thing that they had done with Epic. Not the case. I can confirm that I have seen a version of this clause in a recent PlayStation agreement with one of my portfolio companies, and it's clearly still in effect. They are clearly still asking for a cut of revenue if they happen to do better than expected in terms of the amount of hours played on PlayStation versus how they do in terms of their ability to monetize those players. And this is particularly onerous for the platform-based publishers because they're effectively paying a double tax on those users. First, they're paying on the platform that those users are actually transacting on, and then again to satisfy Sony for the top-up. So not a good situation. And again, it shows you how important the market power of Sony is in being able to get these clauses into their software publishing agreements with third parties, because having your game available for play on PlayStation is so very important.
It just keeps coming back to, like you said, these platform-based publishers are really starting to accrue a lot of value, and the tensions are clearly clashing with the giants or the incumbents in the space. And Phil Spencer, round of applause for him, and that he really had the foresight to see all this coming all the way back in 2015, 2016, where he's starting to work on the early innings of rolling out Game Pass.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see how this border war between the platforms and the platform-based publishers play out over the next few years. And I think console is a really interesting battleground. You think about Valve's release of the Steam Deck as being kind of in the same vein, right? It's an opportunity to take their vast software library and rather than fight against the existing consoles or acquiesce to the existing consoles, to basically build their own console. Now, that may not be the best strategy for fighting with them as a platform-based publisher, but nevertheless, it can be seen in the same vein. So I think we've gotten to the end of this story. Hopefully we've been able to shed some light on the console and why the console is interesting in the modern era. In the next episode, we're going to go and spend a bunch of time in what is another hardware arena, the virtual reality space. And we're going to talk about why virtual reality continues to be this dream in the video game business and why it's largely an unrealized reality.